Greetings. My name is Paul Ried. We recently hosted our Client Economic Outlook Luncheon at the Arizona Biltmore Hotel in Phoenix. That was primarily for our clients who reside in Arizona. It was very well received, and we want to thank all of you who attended. Well, you're about to hear remarks from our keynote speaker, Craig Columbus. He spoke on America over the next 10 years. I think you'll find his comments insightful and interesting. First, a little background on our speaker. Craig Columbus is CEO of Columbus Macro, LLC. In his role, he oversees investment decision-making and sets the strategic direction of the firm. He's a popular speaker and shares his insights across a variety of prominent media platforms. Mr. Columbus is known for identifying key macro trends and putting complex concepts into understandable language. He also served as CEO of Tower Square Investment Management, CEO of First Allied Asset Management, as well as market strategist for Primark Corporation. On behalf of your financial team, we hope you'll enjoy his remarks and find them informative.
Well, thank you to Tim and to Paul and to Adam and Kelly, who's not here. Yes, we had, if we were all in together in Seattle the day after the election, and a lot has changed. A lot has changed. I'll say one thing from the news, the headlines of public policy. You may have seen that Larry Kudlow was announced to replace Gary Cohn as Trump's sort of head economic advisor. That was just announced this morning. So back in the day, Kudlow had a program on CNBC. I was part of that show every Friday for 3 years. And while Larry and I didn't always agree on every aspect of public policy or economic policy, I'll just say I think he's going to do an excellent job, and the country's going to be really well served. So I think good news on that front. So I do think there's a lot of interesting things to talk about. And I remember saying at that event when we were sort of in the early hours of the transition that there were good things happening in the economy, and they had started in the summer of 2016. Those good things were already starting to be reflected in financial markets long before any ballot was cast for Mr. Trump or Mrs. Clinton in either regard. And so what we're going to talk about a little bit today now is what do I think that the economic outlook is telling us and how we should sort of prepare for it. So I'm very interested in the future. Charles Kettering was the head of R&D for General Motors for about 20 years, became one of the earliest technology investors, and he sort of thought about the future, and that's kind of where I would like us to think about for today as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about inflation, and inflation is one of those things that thinks about looking forward. It's about making expectations. That's how markets sort of price in expectations, and those expectations for inflation have essentially been going up since November. Now, why do you care? You care because why that happened was in the early part of January and into early February, we got interest rates went up on the notion that inflation was perhaps going higher, and that was the first bout of volatility that we've had in really 2+ years in the stock market in the United States and really around the world, and we had our first 5% sell-off. And that was really in large part because inflation expectations were going up and markets were pricing that in. So that's why we care. Now, for many of you in this room, you'll get it. I'm in my 50s. But for many younger professionals in my field, they had to go scurrying to the basement to look up what does this inflation thing mean. Because in the 1980, if you looked around the world, G7 plus China at the time, the average rate of inflation around the world was about 12%, as you all know. But by the end of that century, inflation was largely extinct in the industrialized world. And we already know why, as many of you hear from your Boeing experience. We were here because China joined the WTO in 2001. They flooded the market with all sorts of cheap goods. They brought in a whole new supply of labor, of working-age labor. They built a large surplus of foreign currency. They took that foreign currency and they recycled it back into U.S. Treasuries, bringing interest rates down and disinflation in the world. The price of imported goods went down, and inflation was largely extinct. So it begs the question, in a world where largely there has been disinflation has been the primary driver for the last 15 years. And disinflation isn't necessarily a bad thing, because the fact that your computer or your flat-screen TV has gone down in terms of price, that's good. And disinflation primarily means for a consumer that actually your consumption of luxury goods goes up because you've been able to meet your basic needs. These are all positive things. However, when Mr. Bernanke was the head of the Fed, and he was a scholar based on the Depression in the 1930s, he had done his scholarly work at Princeton on the Depression, and deflation to Mr. Bernanke was a very negative word because he viewed that the housing crisis that we experienced in the country was largely a function of deflation. It meant that the collateral for which loans were borrowed against was largely going down in value. When the collateral goes down, the loan becomes more at risk. As those loans default, it cascades through the banking system. So Mr. Bernanke and many people view deflation as a very negative thing, and it has real extreme consequences. And I will say the best analogy for deflation is it's like diabetes. It has all sorts of other negative consequences. So when there's what they call the velocity of money slows down in the sort of economic system, you have lending slows down, people stop purchasing, the economy starts to slow, and all these things start to cascade. So it has sort of benign effects, and it can have very dangerous effects. But one of the things we have to think about, aside from sort of why have we had largely an extinction around the headline inflation that we knew from the 1980s, there's all these forces that have been putting a cap on it. And they're forces that some of which you probably have thought about, and maybe some of you have not. Organized labor. The bargaining power of organized labor has largely been diminished in a world of globalization. The San Francisco Fed has written extensively on this subject. The fact that older workers, higher skill, higher wage older workers are leaving the workforce and they are being replaced by less skilled, lower wage, younger employees. So therefore, it affects wage inflation. And there's this notion of fertility. Fertility has been falling at the same time that longevity has been rising. So why does fertility affect deflation? In a very big way. If you have fewer people working, they're producing fewer goods. And if you want to look at a classic example, this would be Japan. In 1990, the live birth rate in Japan was half of what it was in 1970. Half. That's a very big number. So if you want to understand your purchasing cycle as a human being, it's about 46. You consume the most at age 46, and then your consumption tends to trail off. So men, particularly men in their 60s, their consumption of apparel plummets. They stop buying dress clothes. And the guy says, wait a minute, what do you mean I can't wear my golf shirt to the wedding? It's my best shirt, right? So, very true. People know this from personal experience, right? And then this idea of technology and comparison shopping. So I go into a store and I see something and I think, boy, I don't know, is that the right price? And I pull it up on my phone and I get 15 quotes and I have sort of instantaneous comparison shopping, and therefore it puts a lid on cost inflation. Okay? These are all factors that I think you understand. This slide didn't show up, but what I was going to talk about there was one of the things that you sort of see is that we haven't had the same kind of wage growth. So the inflation is in some way the function of wage growth, and as you know, we have a very tight labor market in this country. The unemployment rate has been going down steadily, right? And despite that, we haven't seen the wage inflation that you typically have. And one of the things that you have to remember is if I looked at total compensation, I'm a small business owner, many of you have been in the business world, wage inflation is somewhat a distortion because my costs for health care, unemployment insurance, et cetera, have been going up. So if I looked at total compensation, it actually is kind of back to prior levels. It just hasn't been passed on to the employee in forms of higher wages. And then we have some very hard and difficult issues. One of them is the great male flight from work. And this is a very uniquely American phenomenon, somewhat in other parts of the developed world, but for men between the ages of 25 and 54, which is the prime earning period, we have men leaving the workforce at a record pace. We rank 82nd in the world in terms of 25 to 54 male age employment. They leave the workforce for all kinds of things. Better leisure activities, video games, social media, disability insurance, all kinds of reasons. But the reality is men in their prime producing years are leaving the workforce. That's putting a cap on inflation, right? We're losing the sort of key driver of economic growth. And the second one, which I talk about for 5 years, and I tried to make this point, and I'm glad to see that it has become a popular phenomenon in public psyche, is the notion of addiction. And I wish I could tell you that we were going in the right direction, but we're not. And so I could cite you some statistics, the fact that we have 2 million people in rehabilitation for opioid addiction right now. I could tell you that we're roughly 4% of the world's population and we consume 85% of the world's opioids. I could tell you that there's enough prescriptions for every man, woman, and child to have some opioid-related product. I could tell you that not only are people transitioning now from opioids, but to black tar heroin, which is kind of a kissing cousin, and fentanyl, which comes from China. Heroin comes from Mexico. And if you want to do something to secure our border, I'll tell you the number one thing that I would do. I would increase our X-ray technology, because X-ray technology is the key to interdiction of these high-quality products, these high-value products. Heroin, et cetera, does not walk across the southern border of the United States. It comes through in trucks. And the reality is we X-ray less than 10% of cargo coming into the United States. If we invested in sort of cargo X-ray interdiction, we really could make a difference. But this is the issue of addiction, and the model has changed because we have so many people struggling with this issue. I deal with manufacturing executives all the time, and they tell me, I can't find people to pass a drug test. Now you see why this holds back our economy. It's destroying our sort of economic potential. It's eating the country alive. It is a public health crisis. It's a law enforcement crisis, but it's also an economic crisis. This is actually, I was speaking to somebody, a very kind person earlier, about Prescott, Arizona. This was a sort of an example. The sort of treatment model is changing. The idea that sort of you go to a treatment facility and insurance pays $30,000, that's kind of changed. A whole class of entrepreneurial people have come into the country who now they sort of separate the treatment side from the resident side. So they sort of insurance only paying for part of that. So the residential side in Prescott at one point in the last 2 or 3 years, they had over 170 sober living facilities in a city of 42,000 people. And it shows you the sort of the scope of the crisis, right? These are real issues. Phillips curve just said as the labor market tightens and more people are working, unemployment is low, wages should go up. Those wages going up means the company then has to pass on the cost of those higher wages to you, the consumer, in terms of higher prices. But that model has been broken, and therefore we haven't had the inflation that we normally saw. But inflation is not easy to measure. It's a sort of a hard phenomenon. It's not one of those things that just sort of easily rolls off your tongue. And you say, well, what do you mean? It's in part because we have all of these one-off events. So in January, we saw a big spike in apparel, the biggest spike in apparel since 1990 in terms of the inflation metrics, in part because we had very mild weather, then we have very cold weather. And my favorite is hurricane-related car replacement. Houston is a very big car town in the country. Over 500,000 cars were taken off of the road in Houston, and we had a big replacement cycle come around that. So my point is, all of these things are distorting. And there's lots of different ways we can measure inflation. The Fed does it one way, private industry does it another way. Economists can't really agree on it. And Mrs. Yellen, who has been on the Fed since 2002, right, was Mr. Bernanke. She was head of the San Francisco Fed, then was the vice chair to Mr. Bernanke, and then was the chair before being replaced by Mr. Trump. She said, we don't yet fully understand inflation. And we could make an economist joke here, and we could say, yeah, they don't really know. It's like weather forecasting, but it's hard. Predicting inflation is not an easy issue, and I guess Paul made a joke about macro forecasting, and he's probably right about that. It is not an easy thing to do, right? And I'm in the business of doing that. But there has been kind of a sea change. So you say, well, why are you talking about this? I'm talking about it because I set it up for you in the beginning, because we had a sell-off in February on the basis that inflation was perhaps going higher. So all those forces that I said were a cap, that were a lid, something changed, and maybe we have to rethink it. Okay, so let's rethink it. Now here's the good news. For the first time in a very long time, we have had synchronized global growth. And I show a slide, and it's kind of comical, but I'll tell you the reality is last year in 2017, all 45 countries tracked by the OECD had positive economic growth. That's good. Everybody is swimming in the right direction, right? So if you think about it like this, the spread between growth in the United States, Japan, UK, and the European Union was the tightest it's been since 1995. They were all swimming in the same direction. And as the economy picks up, you would expect some interest rates to go up, right? You would expect there to be more inflationary pressure because things are good, not just in the United States, but the economy is firing on all cylinders around the world. Very, very good fact. Although for all the talk of protectionism in the country, we've had the highest trade deficit in 10 years. When that trade deficit is high and the value of the dollar is low, you tend to import some inflation, and that gets passed on in form of producer prices, and that's one of the reasons we saw. Oil prices were higher. Gasoline prices were up about 30%. OPEC sort of figured out how to sort of deal with the curve of the oil market, and by their way of doing that, it sort of put pressure on shale producers. They couldn't lock in future prices, so oil went up. It's one of the other factors. And then a big one for which everyone in this room knows, although you probably don't know this by the terminology. The government, the Federal Reserve, has been purchasing, or was purchasing, under what's called quantitative easing, was purchasing U.S. government debt. The Federal Reserve was purchasing government debt. In economics, they call that financial repression. It's like holding a basketball underwater. And all it means is you are holding interest rates below the level of inflation. And anybody that is a saver in this room knows that interest rates being very low, and it makes it a challenge for you to sort of live off of your savings when financial repression is going on. Now, when they formed the European Union, it was done by something called the Maastricht Treaty. And they said, you know what? This is a really bad idea. Government should not be able to buy its own debt. But the Europeans have been engaged in that same kind of quantitative easing, and they're still doing it. In part by getting around it, they'll say, that's true. Government will not buy its own debt. It'll just buy its own debt from private banks, and therefore it will be okay. So they're very clever people, and they got around this issue. But in the United States, there is less financial repression. No more QE. The government is not purchasing its own Treasury debt. And the United States the Federal Reserve's balance sheet is starting to come down. And so that basketball is starting to come up in the water. In some level, that's good news for savers, but it's one of the things that perhaps make there be more inflation. And then this idea of tax cuts. Very important point. Not necessarily a negative, but it's just something we have to be aware of. When you give a sort of a one-time bonus to a whole bunch of employees, they tend to spend it. And CEOs tend to invest in companies, capital expenditure. These are good things, but it happens to sort of percolates the economy, and those forces can be potentially inflationary. And the other thing is, it's just the timing of it is kind of interesting. We usually don't do stimulus, like big tax package reform, when the economy is doing very good. We tend to do it when the economy is bad, like in 2003, we had Bush tax cuts, right? So the timing of it is a little different. We don't usually juice the economy at a time when it tends to be running on full cylinders, and we have very low unemployment. We had synchronized global growth, and so therefore that potentially is an inflationary force. And then the idea is to pay for that, we're going to issue more debt. So we're going to issue a record amount of Treasury debt this year. And all the other times we have tried sort of tax reform, the debt to GDP has been about 40%. Today we're up around 80%. So we're going to be issuing more debt at a time that potentially that could cause interest rates to go up as well. And we have a new chair of the Fed. So this is Mr. Powell, who took over, not a classically trained economist, but actually a lawyer, who's going to be tested. And almost all Fed chairmen tend to be tested within the first 6 months. It's kind of, I think, a rite of passage. I don't know. And every time we have tax cuts, we had it in 2003, et cetera, you tend to have more volatility in markets, as Paul was discussing earlier. You tend to have more volatility because markets have to price in, hey, what does all this new tax cut stuff mean? Right? It's different. And you got to remember the way we did this now. In 1988, in sort of the Reagan tax reform era, remember, Mr. Reagan had sort of a series of tax reforms, and those tax reforms had a very sort of a bipartisan component to it. It took him sort of 3 tries to kind of refine it. Remember, we kind of did tax reform in like 60 days. It was like a gumball rally where every lobbyist and whatever descended on Washington, D.C. to get these tax cuts done. So it would go into effect in 2018. And my point is we're going to have to kind of, you will likely see significant revisions to that as they realize, hey, this is working, this isn't working, this is not what I was intending it to do, am I encouraging one industry over another, et cetera. So Mr. Powell is going to have a difficult job because in theory he could be facing higher inflation. But at the same time where, Mr. Trump very much uses the financial markets as a scorecard of success, and so he has to balance sort of markets over, sort of the real economy overheating versus sort of tapping the brakes on stock market rallies. That's not an easy job. Mr. Powell has inherited a harder environment than his predecessors had. So this whole thing about inflation is kind of tied to a wave theory. There's an economist named Fisher, sort of the seminal work, and he says you kind of have these waves and they crest, and then they have like a consolidation for like 30, 40 years, and then they crest again. And so I think in theory we're kind of moving to sort of out of that consolidation wave at a time when it's really important, because we have a whole bunch of people in this country who have not participated at the level of all of these people in the room here today. And I say that because it's very difficult. If you have any kind of college education in the country right now, the long-term unemployment rate is less than 2%. If you want to do anything for your kids, your grandkids, go to some form of education. Doesn't matter where, doesn't matter what you study. But for people on the other side of that curve, without the educational skills in today's economy, it's a very difficult place. And you would think, as all those men are leaving the workforce, you would think that for lower skilled, those that are willing to work, wages would go up. But they haven't. They've done the opposite. Your job prospects have gone down at the same time where your wages have gone down. In economics, they call it demand curve shifting. That is a very rare phenomenon. That's like a unicorn. Fewer people are willing to work. Those that are willing to work, you would think, would be able to experience higher wages, and they can't. That's an economic unicorn. So we have to really get this right. These are important issues. Because for all these fancy talk about inflation, and we can measure it all sorts of different ways, Mom and Dad care about their standard of living. How am I living? And a lot of people feel like I'm not keeping up. And I say that in real estate as a classic one because 80% of the major metropolitan markets in the country, real estate prices are rising at 2x the rate of wages. Now, that's not a problem for people in your demographic, but for younger people, that's a big demographic. Housing prices have been going up about 6% a year. That's a good thing, right? We've needed our housing market to repair. But it's very, very hard. This is LA County. They just rezoned it to allow people to sort of build backyard structures like garage apartments, granny flat. So there's all of these kind of modular home builders now that will put this in somebody's backyard and you rent it out for $1,500. That's the new American dream right there for a lot of people, right? And so it tells you about housing affordability is a big issue. Now, not how we measure it officially, owner's equivalent rent is how we measure it in inflation, but standard of living. And the one slide that it just skipped over was around drug prices. Now, we can talk about how we measure officially inflation, and it relates to health care. Remember, the government, in some level, they have an incentive for inflation to sort of underestimate the real rate of inflation. A lot of things are indexed to it because they actually collect tax receipts based on how the economy is actually doing. But the slide I was going to show you was many drug prices are essentially going up every 6 months. Every 6 months. Now, we're spending 4.3% a year on healthcare in an economy that's growing 2.5%, and you can't do that forever. You can't, because eventually it will crowd out other priorities like infrastructure, public education, et cetera. And I think this will become a very big issue. Mr. Trump very viscerally understands this issue, and I think in 2020, drug pricing will be an issue much like Build the Wall was in the prior election, because he understands that people connect with that issue, but it's something we have to fix. And we have to fix it because we have all these priorities, like I said before, whether that be dealing with opioid addiction. One I would really like to see is dealing with rural broadband. Remember, Mr. Roosevelt sort of fixed the issue of rural electrification. 10% of the rural population had electricity. And it changed those places forever. Well, right now, we got 1,800 rural communities in this country, counties in this country, who really have very little to no internet service, very sporadic internet service. So what does that mean? Their economics population doesn't keep up in terms of its education, its schooling, the vibrancy of its economy, and you end up with more haves and have-nots. And you end up with a lot of anger, right? So we got to fix this. So we have to get these kind of issues right. Economics matter. And then if you think this is just kind of an academic exercise, I will tell you, and this is good, and thanks to what Paul and Tim and Adam do, you're on the right side of the saver class. And I sleep really good at night, serving savers, because I know that I believe in the value of philanthropy. I believe in the value of intergenerational transfer of wealth. I believe in the value of sort of hard work and job creation that comes from entrepreneurship. And all of these things are why wealth creation is a very noble thing. But it also creates a whole bunch of people in the country who are living on with a retirement savings of less than $5,000 to $10,000, and it begs the question, at some point, the owners of economic rents the owners of stocks and real estate assets have disproportionately benefited relative to wage earners. Now, to kind of make this issue real, this is Sean Parker, who was one of the co-founders of Facebook, and he quoted Mr. Buffett. Mr. Buffett, when asked, what is the secret of your investment success? He said, compounding. So if I ask any of your investment professionals here, compounding inures to the benefit of the saver. And Sean Parker said, I'm a billionaire. It's a very high-quality problem to have. And he said, I'm a billionaire, but I'm going to live 20 to 25 years longer based on my life expectancy and the medical technologies in the world. And if you think income inequality is bad now, give me another 25 years and my $1 billion and the value of compounding, and you'll see the have and have-nots in the world even more. It's a fair point. So finally, Mr. Ray Dalio, who's kind of a famous hedge fund investor at a firm called Bridgewater, said, what are you most concerned about in the world? He said, I'm most concerned, much like me, he says, I think there are many good things happening in the real economy. I think there are many good things happening in terms of tax reform, many good things happening in terms of regulatory reform. But if we don't fix some of these issues, the next time we have an economic downturn in the country, if you think we are dealing with an issue today where the country is hopelessly divided, wait till you have a bad economy and see what those divisions look like. I think it's a very, very fair point. So the crux of the question is this. Is it 1966, which was in some ways very similar to today? They had 4% unemployment. We have 4% unemployment today. Mr. Johnson posthumously passed Mr. Kennedy's tax cut program, so they had tax cuts flowing through the economy. They had the big pickup in government spending around Johnson's Great Society and the Vietnam War, and inflation picked up from, let's call it 2% to over 3%. And when you get over 3% for inflation, it starts creating problems for real assets or financial assets. Or is it like the 1990s, where wages went up actually 4%, but inflation went down because we had all this new technology that came into our lives and it made productivity go up? Which is it? The 60s? In some ways, I don't think maybe the 60s is the right analogy, because remember, a third of the workforce was involved in organized labor with their wages linked to inflation. I think it's much more like the 90s. And I say that with actually some optimism. So in 1923, which is sort of the height of the roaring 20s, the economy grew at 13%. How much would you like to have an economy growing at 13%? Largely on the basis of two inventions, the refrigerator and automobile. The consumerism picked up on those two things, and the economy grew at 13%. But then you know how it ended. We had a banking crisis exacerbated by an environmental crisis of the Dust Bowl, right? Now, I think the good news is where we are today is the banking system in the United States is significantly repaired. What they call tangible common equity of U.S. banks has been significantly improved, not necessarily in Europe. We still have some issues. We've got a lot of non-bank lending going on. It's sort of hard to track how that works. But the core, the heart of darkness of the last financial crisis, I think is in much better shape to weather any kind of economic downturn that we were to have. It doesn't mean we're not going to have a downturn, because you can't sort of rule out or sort of wring out of the system the laws of economic nature. And that's in some ways, I think, a good thing, that the laws of economic nature are normalizing. I don't want a world where the Federal Reserve holds a basketball underwater forever. One, because it doesn't serve the saver class. It creates all sorts of asset bubbles and distortion, which don't sort of work to our favor. And in fact, the zero interest rate policy reflects an economy that's on life support. And I'm here to say we are no longer on life support. And in fact, things are pretty darn good. And it's okay for the laws of economic nature to reassert themselves. But we got to get a couple things right. We got to get this issue of productivity right. So it looks like the 1990s, inflation doesn't come rip-roaring back like it did in the late 60s. And if you think this is an issue, I just think of productivity like this. I'm able to do more with less. There's all kinds of fancy economic definitions, but I'm able to do more with less. And that's a very good thing, right? And if you think this is all just sort of academics, when the rate of productivity is doubling, and it did that from 1950, that was kind of the long-term productivity, the standard of living, not some official inflation measure, but the way that people experience, the standard of living doubles every 40 years. If productivity only grows at 0.5 or half of 1% like it's done in the last, let's call it 5 years, the standard of living in the country doubles every 140 years. So it's really important to get productivity right. It makes a difference in the lives of real people. Now, you see productivity going up in lots of different places in the world. The Abe government in Japan was left for dead by the side of the road, and through a whole bunch of measures and trial and error has actually got its economy starting to grow, experiencing real economic growth. There's no inflation in Japan. If you think we have a tight labor market in the United States, there's essentially no unemployment in Japan. There's essentially no unemployment in Germany. The unemployment rate is the lowest level it's been since reunification, right? So this is a global phenomenon. In part, a very, very good thing. Women are returning to the workforce, or have largely been excluded from the workforce for a whole variety of reasons in Japan, and are now starting to participate. Foreign students as well, too. We had a big spike in productivity in the 70s when women started to join the workforce in the United States. This is a really good thing. Dealing with the whole sort of Me Too issues, there's a whole bunch of economic research on this now that says make the workplace feel safer for women and the productivity will go up, and you better darn believe it will. There's a good thing. These things are moving in the right direction. And then we have a whole bunch of automation coming, and it's going to touch so many industries, agriculture being one of them, and trucking. So the last job you can really do in the country without a college diploma is long-haul trucking. There's 1.7 million long-haul truckers in the country. You can make a very good living doing long-haul trucking. You make about $50,000 a year. You can make about $70,000 a year with benefits, and there's great demand for it. But automation or autonomous vehicles are coming to long-haul trucking in the next 10 years with all likelihood. I was in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is the heart of American autonomous vehicles. Is coming in a very, very big way. And to work this out, and I think about what that will mean. Well, it could create problems because we've got 1.7 million truckers, but I could actually make the argument that the person sort of behind the wheel monitoring this, the truck will never stop. Other than for the guy to go to the bathroom and to whatever, the truck will never stop. And think if the truck never stops, how much productivity can go up. Think about what it could do for logistics in the country. The truck will never stop. These are very, very powerful forces, right? So one of the reasons why I think it looks a lot more like the 1990s is that all this new technology will come into the marketplace. But there's limits to what the real economy benefit can be to workers. So I'm originally from Pittsburgh. My dad worked in United States Steel, and so steel is near and dear to my heart. I say many times, so when Mr. Trump was trying to talk about my grandpa came to the United States, he worked in a coal mine. And so when I say, we're going to fix steel and coal, I come a-running. I'm right there, man. You tell me how to do it. And I spent a lot of time studying steel economics. And the reality is, at the height of our steel making capacity in the country, about 650,000 people worked making steel. Today it's about 125,000 are in the steel manufacturing business. But sort of at the height of that, it took us about 10 human man-hours to make 1 ton of steel. And today it takes us less than 2. You do more with less. It's pretty good, right? It's pretty good. We make more with less. So as much as we want to talk about sort of tariffs or protectionism, there are just limits, and we do need sort of think about it from a public policy perspective. And the Chinese have been subsidizing their steel industry in a way that doesn't show up in tariffs, but they sort of subsidize the raw material cost. So a big part of making steel is water and energy cost, and the Chinese subsidize that, so it sort of makes it an unfair advantage. So I'm not saying there's not issues here, but my point is there's only so much we can move the needle because technology has changed the need for man, right? Okay. Now, McKinsey has a study, and I don't know, it's like trying to predict into the future, but they say by the year 2030, automation and its forces will displace about 1/3 of the world's workforce. 1/3 of the world's workforce. Which means we're going to need a Marshall Plan to figure out what do we do with all these people. We got to have some productive outlet. We got to put them back to work, and we got to figure out how to do it. And this is not going to be easy. And we're going to have to hold the society together. At a time when you are starting to see all of our civic institutions, all of our social institutions are starting to fray. You ask people in public opinion polling, what is your opinion of certain institutions? Mass media, lower. Organized religion, lower. Organized labor, lower. Public education, lower. And the only one that they have sort of a higher opinion of is police and fire. And all of these institutions which bind us together are starting to fray at the edges. And at the same time, government, right? There's a decreasingly dark view of expertise. People say, I've had enough of these experts. I've had enough of eggheads in the world. And so the point is we got to hold it together somehow, and we're going to have to figure out how to do it. We're going to have to figure out as a society how to do it. And the dark side of that is that you tend to, when you're on the outside looking in of all the economic prosperity which you experience in this room, you tend to blame somebody else. And some of that is directed at foreigners, people who are new to the society, and we've got 65 million refugees in the world. We've got 250 million economic migrants, people looking for work elsewhere, and it's a complicated subject because you need immigration to work. It's just math. If you had 16, most people immigrate to a country when you're younger in your life cycle, so you have more productive years to work. It just makes sense, right? 1950, we had 16 people working for every one that was retired. Today, we have 3 working for every one retired. In not too many years, we're going to have 2 working for every one retired, and if you don't fix that problem, the math just outruns you. You got to fix it. But they're hard issues, because it isn't like when my grandpa came to the United States with a shirt on his back and no public school education, because it's much harder to integrate into a world which I just discussed without the skill set. The prior generations of immigrants had a much easier time immigrating into the world than they do today. Oh, and by the way, it's a legitimate concern to say transnational terrorism is a real issue, and you need to understand who lives and works in your country. But we got to fix this problem, right? Now, there are some good things happening. Google is a classic example of technology. So I love chess. Chess is a 1,400-year game. 1,400-year-old game. They've been playing chess for 1,400 years. But technology has made sort of computer versions of chess for many, many years. And the traditional way of doing it is you study kind of human. There's beginnings of games, there's middles of games, and end games. Computers sort of learn that technology. And we've had, remember, Garry Kasparov played, IBM Big Blue. So we've had computer engines for chess that have been teaching people the game for really 25 years. We've had very robust engines. Google's division, DeepMind division, created a chess engine, and using artificial intelligence, it taught itself the game. Not in the traditional way that you would teach yourself chess. It taught itself the game in 4 hours. 4 hours. And it played Stockfish, which is the leading chess engine, and it absolutely obliterated it. It taught itself the game in 4 hours. It did it in an unconventional way. And it took the leading chess engine for which all the top players in the world train on, and it absolutely obliterated it. Now, imagine if that technology was applied to all sorts of different places. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, very, very powerful stuff. And some places where it's applied to is my world, my industry. Making smarter decisions, right? Because the number of terminals that Bloomberg had actually declined in 2016. Bloomberg is a high-end application. It costs about $25,000. Very popular for money managers like myself. It's sort of core to our investment process. Then actually the number of terminals sold went down. In part why? Because you could do more with less. I own one of these firms. I can tell you technology inures to my benefit, much like it inures to the benefit of all of your firm. And you can apply it in all sorts of different ways that benefit clients. And I think there's some ways you're living in a great era. A great era. Imagine if it was the 40s. And I wanted to get diversification. I wanted to own 500 stocks. How did I do that? How do I do it? Well, now we have 3,200 indices that track almost everything around the world with a mutual fund or an ETF, all kinds of investment instruments that are linked to it. And they put them in the hands of investment professionals, right? Like Adam. And say, go to work, use these tools, build me a diversified portfolio. And I mean, you're living in the halcyon era, right? This is good times. Now, I'm going to admit, there's some complexities, and I want you to understand complexities. The world is moving so fast. In my world, in the professional investment world, there is so much technology that is linked to real-time information. And it's using artificial intelligence and all sorts of other techniques which, harnessed correctly, can do great things. But this is April of 2014. Somebody hacked the Twitter account of the Associated Press and said that the White House is under attack and President Obama had been injured. The S&P 500 fell over 1% in less than a minute. Less than a minute. Now, Mr. Trump tweeted out recently he didn't like a report that Brian Ross of ABC News had done, which essentially said he had encouraged or directed Mr. Flynn to contact the Russians during the campaign, not the interim period or post in his period as National Security Advisor. Mr. Trump says you should consider hiring a lawyer and suing ABC for damages. The world is moving so fast now, and we don't have a workable media model in this country, regardless of your political views. We don't have a workable media model, and there's so many crazy conspiracy theories and information on the internet. It is both the world's greatest library and the world's greatest landfill at the same time. And in that capacity, man, now I'm linking all these real-time information and real-time applications to things that matter, right? People's retirement savings, pension plans, college endowment models. This is no longer just an academic exercise. And some of the things about when investment is all kind of tied to indexes, and one of the things that Adam does in your portfolios is you have a very active approach to investing. And so when companies underperform, managers vote with their feet. They don't like the company. They don't like what the management is doing. It's not engaged in best practices. It's failing to deliver results. I fire the company. I sell as a money manager, and I move on. But we just have this whole idea of basket or index-based buying. And some of these companies, let's use sovereign wealth funds as a good example, right? So like the Swiss National Bank and the Japanese Monetary Authority, they both buy a lot of stocks, but they buy indexes. They buy big baskets. So they buy all the companies. So it's not disciplining companies that underperform because I'm essentially buying all of them. You're like a quasi-permanent investor. That's the dark side. Now, I do think governance is getting better in the country. If you think about when was the last time we had a major accounting scandal? Enron, WorldCom. So I think governance is starting to get better. When I first started in the industry, you know, O.J. Simpson was on the board of like 4 public companies. He was on the audit committee of one of them. And, you know, so I think we're getting a more disciplined approach because CEOs and chief financial officers have to certify results, and I think that's a good thing. So where in this technology as it relates to you and your investing, I actually think the benefits are going to outweigh the costs. I showed you some of the costs, but let's use inflation that we talked about. I think it's going to allow us, this is aerial, satellite data. And there's a whole bunch of investment managers and hedge funds that are taking satellite data. This is Chinese ports. And they're analyzing that information in real time, linking it to machine-based learning to try to give us a better sense of how's the economy doing. I'm not just guessing anymore. I'm not calling people up on the phone and saying, hey, what are you seeing? I'm literally analyzing rail car, ore shipment, everything in real time and linked to all kinds of data. These are very, very powerful applications, and inflation, I think, will start to get better real-time information. It will be embedded, and we'll have a better sense, and it won't be less of a guessing game. And these things will be a very positive thing for investors and for society as well. But it requires us to make good choices. Good choices is what this room is all about. And so I tried to use an analogy. This is the country of Norway, 4 million people. It's the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world. In 1996, some very smart people got together in Norway and said, we're getting all of this oil revenue in the North Sea. What if we took that and invested it? And little by little, they started to do that, and now they have over $1 trillion. It's the largest investment pool in the world is owned by the country of Norway. They own over 1% of every listed company in the world. They buy index-based buying. But the country of Norway, last year, the government has typically used a 4% withdrawal rate to determine sort of funding for its sort of public needs and expenditures. Last year, it lowered that withdrawal rate to 3% on the theory that we've had such a big move in stocks, the expectation for forward returns would be lower, potentially higher inflation. So it kind of downgraded its withdrawal rate based on its expectation of forward returns because we've had a great period, right? In some ways, that's just sort of smart planning. Now, smart planning is a big beneficiary of all of the tools and technology. So I'll give you an example. If I asked you, do you think there's more or less bank tellers in the country today? Fewer, right. That's the logical thing that most people would say. It's actually more. It's more. There's fewer per branch, but there's more branches, and so therefore there's more tellers. And they've kind of repurposed the teller from being somebody that says 5, 10, 15, 20. I mean, a machine can do that. A machine can do that. But they've sort of repurposed them into being more of a generalist, somebody that can help you with your mortgage, direct you to an investment person, deal with some of your customer service needs. And the point is they've tried to take the human and repurpose them to their highest and best use and surround them with technology that can handle more mundane tasks. A guy named Michael Kramer from Harvard has done great work on this subject, this idea about how does technology interact with humans and how does it go to benefit other humans. And he uses it called the O-ring principle. Remember, the O-ring was the part of the Space Shuttle Challenger that failed. Every other part of the launch was seamless, but for the O-ring, which was a small part which froze on the launch pad in unusually cold weather at Cape Canaveral and resulted in the Challenger disaster. And Mr. Kramer says that essentially all those pieces of technology, while invaluable, they magnify the role of the human expert, which is essentially the O-ring. So all of that technology, while as powerful as it is, it magnifies the role of the human being, and it's the human that actually essentially brings those pieces together in an integrated, holistic, powerful way. It's very, very important that somebody performs that function, right? Because here's the bottom line. Machines are getting very good at answering questions, and humans have to get much better at asking questions. It is the key to all of our future and our productivity, etc. So this is my last slide, and is very relevant to what you're doing here today. Amazon talks a lot about symphony in its processes, which I think is a very powerful analogy. They say, I combine artificial intelligence, algorithms, logistics, and human beings in a symphony, a very powerful symphony. And certainly the company has disintermediated or transformed all sorts of industries. And I think the model applies to what we're doing here today. So I think the way it works to the benefit of all of you, is the fact that there is a symphony going on of which you are a part of. Right? And the symphony is people like myself. I do a very specialized type of work, economic forecasting, thinking about sort of the global macro picture. But it's really people like Paul and Tim and Adam and the people back in Seattle who take all of that technology, which is inured to your benefit, ability to conduct research in real time, ability to think about financial planning scenarios, the ability to think about what if something changed in my life? How would I do that? Let me model that out. Let me see what it looks like. Let me think about how would I deal with unforeseen events in my life. All these things are very powerful, and they come together in a symphony, which actually can be incredibly powerful. And I'm super optimistic about the future for all the reasons that I said. I think we have a new productivity wave coming. I think we're going to have to get it right, and Americans can get it right. So if you want to get down and you say, we're so super divided and we're never going to be able to figure out these problems, just think back to the early 1900s. A large portion, over 40% of the country working in agriculture, and mechanization came into the scene. Today, less than 2% of Americans work in agriculture. I don't think anyone is going without meals in the United States. So how did they figure it out? What did they do? A bunch of very smart people got together, and they said, you know what? There's too many people that leave high school education early. We don't have the right educational model, and they started what's called the high school model, where they wanted to have compulsory education, and they wanted to sort of within 25 years change the way sort of the average person's participation in schooling. And within 25 years, it had completely transformed it. It had completely transformed it. They saw a problem, they figured out a solution, and they applied it. Now, I'm not going to say these are easy answers, because there are no easy answers to very complicated problems. But I will say there are many things that are inuring to your benefit. Technology is coming together. It makes your financial life better. It can make your personal life better. And we as a country are very good, when backs against the wall, at figuring out very complicated problems. It's an upward surge of American entrepreneurship and exceptionalism, which I think is incredibly powerful. So, with that, I will say, very different, Paul, than when we got together the day after Election Day, where we're like, holy Toledo, what just happened here? Okay? I'm sure some people still say, holy Toledo, what just happened here? But I have to deal with the world as it is, right? So, and I will say the real economy has done extremely well. I do think we have to accept the fact that the business cycle cannot be wrung out, and we will face other difficult times and our challenges, and we've probably pulled forward quite a bit of gains and expectations, but that's okay, because you're coming up as a saver class, and you're in the hands of top financial professionals armed with tools who can sort of help navigate whatever that future looks like. So with that, I will say, listen, I really appreciate your time and your attention, and I think, Paul, we have time for about 10 minutes of questions on any topic you would like to discuss. Yes, sir.
How are we going to get around the problem of the stagnation of our political system? The two-party system is just not working.
Yeah, so the question was, how do we get... I'm glad you started me off with an easy question. how do you fix the American political system? I was hoping I appreciate that. Yeah, so political divisions, a super issue. And you know, the funny thing is that partisanship or partisan media is a big, very complicating factor to how we view America. Now, in the 1930s, we had a whole bunch of daily newspapers in the country. In big cities, we had New York, 10, 11 daily newspapers, right? And each one of them kind of catered to a certain political persuasion. And they kind of identified themselves as sort of appealing intentionally to a certain partisan mindset. And they identified themselves as such. And listen, partisanship is nothing new, right? I mean, it's nothing new. We had extremely partisan media in the country. Well, go study media at the turn of the century. The challenge was that they didn't really sort of hold themselves out there as saying, like, they were openly partisan. And that's true in most of Europe as well, too. Openly partisan. I get worried sometimes in the United States when we have partisan media that sort of tries to identify itself as nonpartisan, or it's their version of the news, and you end up with this place where we're no longer saying, I'm right, you're wrong, it's saying, I'm right, you're evil. And when you get to a place like that, it's very, very difficult. So I don't have an easy answer, but I will tell you one of the things that I think is coming, and you see this in Europe. I think big technology, is going to go through a regulatory phase. It has kind of had this laissez-faire approach to saying, I have this model, I approach technology, it's kind of the consumer-led, organic, the battle of ideas will sort of prevail. But Europeans very much, because most of these big tech companies are not European-based, very little footprint in Europe. So what they're going to do is, I like what we see greater regulation of kind of the social media world and technology around it. Now that could hurt in some ways, sort of the spread of innovation, but I think we are likely to see a more regulated social media world, which is where a lot of the kind of, I don't know what the right word is, hateful, somebody said. Now I'm going to give you an example of hateful. So mass shootings in the country, right? We've had a whole series of mass shootings. And I work in the financial world, so I spend a lot of time in the East Coast. And so, you know, Newtown in Connecticut, where a lot of very young children were killed. Now, there's a woman from the University of Washington named Kate Starberry who does work on sort of studying the social media response to mass shootings. And she's kind of looked at all of these tweets. And it shows you that there's a proliferation of these tweets that say it was fake, it wasn't real, it's like a false flag, you know, these are just actors, right? Okay, so if you know the way this Newtown community works, I mean, these were not actors, these were babies, okay? These were babies. And to sort of put that out there in kind of a way of saying, listen, you know, you can kind of identify in I mean, how we sort of partisanship or politicize shootings is a really difficult thing. So to your point, I think one of the things is that you will see a greater regulation of the media model. I think you will see a whole bunch of kind of unconventional candidates that sort of, I think the two-party system as it's currently constructed, I think there's a place for other views and how that kind of plays itself out. I think has a lot to do with the way campaigns will be funded in the future. And I think there's some reform that will be done there around campaign financing. And then some of it is I just think people will get tired. I think that ultimately Americans will eventually just get tired of saying, what are we doing here? What are we doing? And we've got to figure out a way to fix it. There is no easy answer to the problem which you identified, but I am actually optimistic that there will be something that will be fixed. Because for all of the problems we've had in the country, right, all of our institutions are still working. All of our institutions of government are still, maybe not the way you would like them to work, but right, the U.S. government is fully functioning. State government is fully functioning. The court system is fully functioning. This is not like some banana republic. So the United States can withdraw any kind of partisanship, right, because our institutions are so durable. This is the genius of constitutional democracy. So, any other questions, please? Yeah.
How does X-ray help discover drugs in a drug?
Okay, so a lot of these kind of ports of entry, they have, they can't sort of examine every vehicle, okay? They can't examine, and it also not only with drugs, but with human smuggling. So they have X-ray technology that sort of is able to, rather than sort of just wave the truck through, maybe because it has a U.S. citizen as a driver, but they're only able to examine a very small number. Some with dogs. Sometimes the X-ray technology doesn't work, right? There's the flow. Part of it is the demand of these port of entry. The infrastructure is just frayed. There's so much traffic, and there's only so many people and dogs and manpower. So you have to sort of use your best guess, right? It's sort of a best guess estimate. But X-ray technology is very, very good, and you can kind of see inside the cabins of these trucks, right? So you can see kind of heat seeking for human beings where they're sort of hidden, or you can see where drugs are hidden in certain compartments. And the cartels have gotten very, very good at the actual points of entry, sort of on the other side. Cartels have a very big network of spotters, observers, to try to kind of identify and direct trucks to certain lanes. It's a very sophisticated operation, and that's something that we need to fix. So the technology is going to get even better, right? The same way the X-ray technology at the airport is getting significantly better, is applying that same thing to sort of goods and services. The same way they apply that technology to shipping containers. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Can you talk a little bit about what impact you think millennials and whatever we're calling the generation behind them are going to have as they become more socially conscious, and we're seeing now some activism with the younger generation?
Yeah, it's really encouraging, right? It is incredibly encouraging to see young people. The question was, what do you think about millennials or whatever we're calling the younger generation? And now we have all these different acronyms. What do you think about as their sort of participation in the process? And I think that we're seeing a whole slew of activism. And you saw in the Virginia elections, young women in particular are starting to participate in a way that's very powerful. And I think that's a great thing. You know, it's really interesting about young people in the current, and it could be largely because of their experience of watching their parents go through the financial crisis, but they're excellent savers. Very good savers. Better than baby boomers as far as savers go, right? It's one of the challenges of why inflation I don't really think it can rip higher, is that the savings rate has essentially gone from 6% down to 3%. Now, some of that is people borrowing against their paper wealth, stock and real estate gains, and you would expect people to do that. But the young people are excellent savers, and I think that's a very, very powerful thing. They have a whole different dynamic, though. Watching young people say, like, what would I need a driver's license for? My brother's a professor at Brown University, and he says how many people say to him, like, the kids are like, I don't have a driver. Why would I get it? Why would I get a driver's license? I used to work in academia, and I speak a lot of times in colleges, and you say to young people like about buying a house, and they say like, who would want to own a house? Like they view it as like an encumbrance, right? Like I want to have an experience. Why would I want to spend my weekend working on a yard? Like I want to be out, biking. I want to do other things like that. And so it's just a different dynamic of how they approach the world. But I will tell you, I'm actually really encouraged. I think their activism and participation is going to be really, really good. I've spent a lot of work thinking about how do you get more people to vote, right? And you look at other models and they say, you make voting mandatory, or you give everybody a holiday, you do it on a Saturday, you make vote by mail a bigger thing, or you do, there's a whole bunch of different models, but the reality is some of it is just starting to see young people rethink about the world and think about its importance, and I think it's really good. I think their saver dynamic is really good. And I think their educational skills are outstanding. What's the really interesting part about that is women and their sort of college degree are sort of the dominant, particularly in graduate school. Graduate degrees to women is far outnumbering graduate degrees to men. And you have kind of these disparities, and this is interesting from a social perspective. My parents did not go to college. But there's a sociologist who will tell you that the college-educated woman is sometimes reluctant to marry the non-college educated man. It's kind of a dynamic. And so in some of the parts of the country, particularly in big cities in the East Coast, you have a man deficit, right? But if you ask me, these are very powerfully good forces. And I think if we can sort of drag education, and I think distance education is going to be a hugely powerful thing and will be really, really good. I think it will add sort of a whole dynamic. But you add young people who are more invested in education, who are more invested in the political process, and who are excellent savers, and I feel really good about the future. I really do. Okay, Paul, I think we're out of time, but you've been great. Thank you so much.